Cora Bennett had spent 9 months breathing life back into a piece of antique lace that everyone else had written off as worthless. And on the morning of her wedding, she finally understood that some people destroy beautiful things simply because they can't bear to see them in hands they consider beneath them. She was 27, an orphan who'd learned her craft at her grandmother's knee in a cramped Boston apartment, a textile restorer whose gifted hands could resurrect fabric that museums had given up on. And yet to the Ashford family, she'd always be nothing more than a seamstress who'd clawed her way toward money they swore she had no right to touch. They'd never let her forget it. Now, in a bridal suite overlooking the cold Atlantic at the family's Newport estate, Theodore Ashford's mother and sister stood over the ruined veil, with sewing shears still warm in their manicured hands. Their lips curled into the satisfied smiles of women who'd never once been told no, and they didn't have the faintest idea that the delicate lace they'd just shredded into ribbons wasn't some forgotten relic from a dusty shop at all. They didn't know it had once belonged to a woman whose name was still whispered with fear across every shipping dock and back room on the eastern seaboard. They didn't know that the man who'd spent 10 years and a fortune hunting for it, the most dangerous man in Boston, had finally traced it to this very church. And they certainly didn't know that their small act of cruelty had just lit a fuse that would burn their entire world to the ground before the sun went down. Drake Holloway didn't forgive, and he didn't forget, and he was about to walk through the doors of St. Cecilia's and end this wedding in front of 500 of the most powerful people in the country. Before we step inside that church, do this real quick. If stories about quiet people who finally get the respect they've earned hit you right in the chest, smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that bridal suite, to the moment those shears went silent, and find out exactly what Cora Bennett decided to do next. Silence crashed down over the room, heavier even than the sound of the scissors from moments before, a silence so thick that Cora could hear her own heart beating slowly, steadily, with a coldness that frightened her. Marguerite Ashford dropped the scissors onto the marble vanity, the metal striking stone with a dry, hard sound, then dusted off her hands as though she had just touched something filthy. "You should have been grateful to us," she said, her voice sweet in a cruel way, "for saving you from turning yourself into a laughingstock in front of decent people. A girl who scraps together bits of discarded fabric like you has no right to wear something she imagines is precious." Priscilla laughed, a shrill sound ringing through the still room, and she leaned close enough for Cora to smell the expensive perfume mixed with the champagne on her breath from the party the night before. "Dear sister-in-law," she whispered, "Theodore will grow tired of you soon enough. Ashford men don't marry girls from apartments without fireplaces. They only play with girls like you for a while and then throw them away. You're only an old thing, exactly like the trash that was lying on the floor just now." The two women looked at each other, exchanging the triumphant glance of people who believed they had won completely, then turned on their high heels with the graceful motion they had spent their whole lives practicing, glided out of the room, and closed the oak door behind them with a soft but final click. Left alone, Cora slowly sank to her knees in the middle of the room. She reached out and picked up a fragile strip of lace, the embroidery she had patiently sewn back stitch by stitch beneath the late-night lamp for 9 months, now torn apart into scraps, scattered across the wooden floor like dried flower petals. For one moment, her throat tightened, her eyes burned, and she thought she would break open the way anyone would in such a moment. But the tears did not fall. Instead, something entirely different rose inside her chest, cold, still, and so clear that it almost made her shiver, a strange calm she had never felt before. She did not cry. She did not run. She sat there among the ruins of the work of her life, and she understood with absolute certainty that she would not walk down the aisle today to become Theodore Ashford's wife, but she would not sneak out the back door in tears like a defeated woman either, giving the Ashford family exactly what they wanted. If they wanted to turn her into a performance of humiliation, then she would give them a performance, just not the one they had imagined. Just then, the door opened hesitantly, and Jonah stepped inside, the only makeup artist she trusted, the young man with kind eyes and skillful hands who had stayed beside her since the early days when she was still struggling in Boston. He stopped short when he saw the torn lace scattered across the floor, his face going pale, and he quickly knelt beside her. "Cora," he whispered, his voice trembling with horror. "Oh my God, what did they do? Let me call a car and get you out of here right now. You don't have to endure another second of this." But Cora only shook her head, and when she lifted her eyes to him, her gaze made Jonah go still, because there was no pain left in it, no weakness, only an iron resolve cold as ice. "I'm not going anywhere, Jonah," she said, her voice so even and calm it was frightening. She stood, gathered the torn pieces of lace into her palms with the tenderness of someone lifting a dying, living thing, then placed them on the vanity in front of him. "I need you to help me with one last thing. Pin these pieces into my hair." Jonah's eyes widened, unable to believe what he had just heard. "What did you say? You want to wear it. But it's been ruined. Everyone will see." Cora smiled faintly, a smile with no happiness in it, only cold, unwavering determination. "Exactly," she replied. "I want all of them to see. I want 500 people in that church to see exactly what kind of people the Ashford family really are. Pin them up, Jonah. Don't hide a single cut." Jonah had just pinned the last strip of lace into Cora's dark hair when the door flew open again, this time without the slightest hesitation, and Theodore Ashford stepped in wearing his perfectly tailored wedding suit, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he fully understood the scene before him. He stopped, his gaze moving over the remaining scraps of lace on the floor, over Jonah's pale face, then settling on Cora's hair, where the torn pieces of lace hung down like a mournful spiderweb. For one brief second, Cora still held on to a fragile thread of hope, still waited for the thing any woman would wait for from the man she was about to marry. Outrage, protection, a step forward to stand on her side. But Theodore only sighed, a tired and annoyed sigh, then rubbed the bridge of his nose as though she were the most troublesome burden of that morning. "Cora," he said, his voice full of reproach, "please stop being dramatic. You know how hot-tempered my mother and Priscilla are. Why do you always have to stir things up on today, of all days?" Cora looked at him, and for the first time in the 2 years she had known him, she saw the real Theodore Ashford with painful clarity, down to every line. "They cut it to pieces, Theodore," she said softly, her voice strangely calm. "They used scissors to cut it apart on purpose, right in front of me. And they laughed." Theodore waved his hand impatiently, his eyes flicking toward the door, where the sound of the organ had already begun to drift in from the sanctuary. "It was only an old piece of fabric," he blurted out, and the very instant those words left his lips, Cora felt something inside her quietly die. "I told you hundreds of times to just go to a shop and buy a proper new veil, an expensive one, the kind people would admire. But no, you had to insist on fussing over that ragged thing you bought from some second-hand dealer. Now Consul Whitaker is already sitting in the front row, the press is packed outside, and you're planning to embarrass my entire family over a piece of lace. Take it off, or have him pin it neatly, then walk out there. I won't let you humiliate the Ashford family today." Cora did not answer right away. In her mind, a memory flickered, that rainy afternoon when she first saw the lace in a damp antique shop in the North End, where the shopkeeper, with shifty eyes, had whispered that it had once belonged to a distinguished lady, long dead, and sworn that it had been bought and sold entirely legally. She had spent nearly all of her small savings to bring it home, never knowing that that very moment had silently tied her fate to a thread she could not yet imagine. But now, standing before Theodore, she no longer saw the lace as a mistake. She saw it as the only honest thing left in this room. "You're right about one thing," she said, lifting her head, her voice ringing so clearly and steadily that even she was surprised by it. "I have spent the past 2 years fussing over something ragged. It just wasn't the lace, Theodore. It was you." Theodore's face darkened with anger and confusion. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped, because the organ outside had grown louder now, more urgent. He stepped back, straightened his collar with a stiff gesture, and the final look he threw at her held no affection at all, only the cold irritation of a man afraid for his own image. "Suit yourself," he said through clenched teeth. "But if you walk out there with that thing on your head, don't say I didn't warn you." Then he turned, strode out of the room, and left the door hanging wide open behind him. Jonah took Cora's ice-cold hand, but she was not trembling. The love she had once felt for that man had vanished completely, without a sound, and what remained inside her was only a cold serenity and a resolve nothing could shake. St. Cecilia Church was packed all the way to the last pews. 500 people from the most elite circles of the entire East Coast, sitting shoulder to shoulder beneath the soaring stone arches, the air thick with the scent of imported white lilies and the soft murmur of privileged whispers. At the end of the aisle, Theodore Ashford stood beside the altar, now and then glancing at the expensive watch on his wrist and exchanging a strained smile with the best man beside him. In the first row on the right, Marguerite and Priscilla sat with their backs held proudly straight, whispering to each other behind silk fans, waiting for the moment when the humiliated bride would either not dare to appear or would drag herself out in a pitifully broken state. In the vestibule, Jonah had done something extraordinary. He had handled each ruined fragment of the torn lace with care and pinned them into Cora's dark hair with every bit of skill he possessed, so that the ripped strips of silk, with their jagged cut edges, flowed down her back like a web, both tragic and heartbreakingly beautiful. It looked exactly like what it was, a brutal act of destruction exposed without disguise, pinned directly onto a bride. "Are you sure about this, Cora?" Jonah whispered, his hands still trembling faintly as he adjusted the back of her skirt. "You don't have to do this. I'm sure, Jonah," Cora replied, her voice so flat there was not a ripple of emotion left in it. "Open the doors." The great organ burst to life, its solemn opening chords ringing through the church, and the heavy doors of the sanctuary were pulled open. Cora stepped into the center aisle. At once, it was as though the breath of 500 people caught in their throats at the same time. The whispering vanished. Then it flared up again into a wave of startled commotion spreading from one row of pews to the next. As Cora walked slowly down the long carpeted aisle, the honored guests leaned out of their seats, their eyes widening in astonishment. They were not looking at her gown. They were staring at the ruined veil cascading down her back. The cuts were painfully clear. The jagged edges of the old lace, violently torn apart, told without words the story of a cruel act of sabotage. A lady in the middle rows raised a hand to cover her mouth. An older man tilted his head and whispered into his wife's ear, his brow furrowed in confusion. Somewhere near the back, a camera clicked softly and then quickly fell silent, as though even the person taking the picture could not believe what had just been captured. She did not walk like a victim. She walked with her chin lifted high, her back perfectly straight, every step steady and measured, giving every pair of eyes in that sacred hall enough time to see, to remember, and to understand exactly what had happened to her in the bridal room that morning. In the front row, the smug smile on Priscilla's face suddenly froze and then vanished completely, replaced by a look of panic mixed with fury as she realized everything was slipping disastrously out of control. She had expected Cora to hide the wound, to shrink in shame, or to dare wear nothing at all. She had never imagined that the girl would dare expose the destruction before the whole world with such defiant pride. By wearing the ruined fabric with dignity, Cora was displaying the cruelty of the Ashford women for every powerful person in this room to witness. Marguerite clutched her silk fan so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her face flushing deep red and then draining pale as the searching glances began to steal toward the row where her family sat. Priscilla lowered her head, trying to avoid the eyes turning toward her, but it was too late, because the story of the torn veil had already been branded into the minds of 500 witnesses. And through it all, Cora kept walking toward the altar, where Theodore stood waiting with a face growing whiter by the second, his jaw clenched tight against the rage rising inside him beyond control. When Cora finally reached Theodore's side at the foot of the altar, he leaned toward her, and through clenched teeth, he whispered in a voice full of poison that only she could hear. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. "I told you to take that trash off. You look insane. You're humiliating me in front of all these people." Cora did not turn to look at him. She kept her head lifted high, her gaze fixed straight ahead on the cross above the altar. And when she answered, her voice was quiet, but every word was cold and clear. "I'm showing your friends exactly what kind of man you are, Theodore," she whispered. "A coward who stood still and watched his family destroy something he once swore he treasured. You wanted me to hide it to protect your dignity, but I'll never hide the truth again just so a man like you can remain comfortable." Theodore went rigid, his face turning from pale white to a dark, angry red, both hands tightening into fists at his sides. But he could do nothing in the crowded sanctuary, with hundreds of eyes and camera lenses watching his smallest movement. Father Donovan, an older man with silver hair, had clearly sensed the suffocating tension radiating from the bride and groom, along with the strange condition of the bride's attire, and he cleared his throat loudly, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the gold-trimmed Bible beneath the searching gaze of the entire congregation. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing up into the soaring stone arches as he tried to keep his tone solemn, though his eyes kept flicking toward the bride's ruined hair. "We are gathered here today, in the sight of God and before this community, to witness the union of this man and this woman in the sacred covenant of marriage. The ceremony continued in an atmosphere so stifling, it was almost unbearable. Cora stood there like a statue, completely separate from the man beside her, her body motionless while her mind was strangely sharp and clear. She was not listening to the words the priest was reading, because inside her head there was only one thing left, one single moment she was waiting for. She knew that according to the old ritual, there would be a moment when the priest paused and asked whether anyone objected to the marriage, and that was the moment she had chosen. She had pictured every movement clearly in her mind. She would turn to face the 500 people watching her. She would remove the engagement ring from her finger and place it in Theodore's palm. Then she would declare before them all that she refused, that she would never become part of this family, and she would walk out through the church doors on her own 2 feet, with her head held high, not as a woman cast aside, but as a woman who had chosen to leave. Tiny beads of sweat dotted Father Donovan's forehead as he approached that part of the ceremony, as though even he sensed that something unusual was about to happen. He swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping once across the deathly silent congregation. Then he spoke, each word ringing clearly beneath the stone vault. "If anyone in this community can show just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together," he proclaimed, "let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." Cora drew in a deep breath. Her hand moved slightly, her fingers beginning to reach for the ring on her other hand, and she prepared to turn around. But she never got the chance. Before even a second of silence could pass, a sound like rolling thunder broke from the far end of the sanctuary. The 2 heavy oak doors of St. Cecilia Church, banded with iron studs, were slammed open so violently that they struck the stone walls with enough force to make the front pews tremble. The organist jolted in shock, his fingers striking one shrill, discordant note before the sound died in the air. 500 heads turned all at once. Striding through the vestibule came 6 men in perfectly tailored black suits, moving with a terrifying precision and a chilling unity, their eyes sweeping over the crowd, small earpieces curling behind their ears. At their head was Bruno Kovac, a large man with a harsh face and eyes that revealed not the slightest flicker of emotion, his stride that of a predator so accustomed to making an entire room hold its breath that he didn't need to think about it. Following directly behind them was a man whose presence seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room. Drake Holloway. He wore a dark suit tailored with exquisite precision down to every last stitch, with no excess detail and not a single crease, radiating the kind of authority that didn't need to show itself, because its very existence already weighed upon the space around it. His face was a mask of coldness and absolute command, his steel-gray eyes sweeping once around the church, and each of his footsteps rang across the marble floor with the steady rhythm of a countdown to some unavoidable fate. He wasn't a guest. He was a force of nature that had just entered a room suddenly too small to contain him. A gasp of fear spread through the privileged crowd, and then the thing that truly froze the air wasn't simply his arrival, but the realization of who he was. The most powerful people on the East Coast, those accustomed to giving orders and making others bow, were now the ones who turned pale the fastest. A senator seated in the 3rd row shrank back almost imperceptibly. A famous real estate tycoon swallowed hard, his hands tightening in his lap. Names were whispered quickly from one ear to another. Names no one dared say aloud, because Drake Holloway was the man all of Boston knew, and no one dared mention in broad daylight. He was the shadow hanging over the docks, the invisible hand guiding the currents of money that moved silently through real estate deals and glittering art auctions, the name even the wealthiest men only dared speak in closed rooms and in hushed voices. Marguerite Ashford, who just moments before had been flushed with rage, was now white as paper, one hand clamped tightly around the arm of her chair. Priscilla sat rigid, her lips parted, but no words came out. Drake Holloway didn't pause to acknowledge the people lowering their heads to greet him in fear. He walked straight down the center aisle, his polished leather shoes striking the stone in crisp beats through the absolute silence. At the altar, Theodore Ashford looked as though he were on the verge of fainting. He stumbled back one step in total confusion, then hurriedly bent his head. "Mr. Holloway," Theodore stammered, his voice cracking like that of a frightened child, and in that instant he forgot the ceremony, forgot even the bride standing right beside him. "Sir, what an honor. There must be some misunderstanding." But Drake Holloway completely ignored him. He didn't even bother to glance at the groom once, as though Theodore Ashford were nothing more than a meaningless piece of furniture blocking his line of sight. His eyes, cold and sharp, had locked onto one single point from the moment he stepped into the sanctuary, and he moved directly toward that point without the slightest hesitation. He stopped right in front of Cora. He stood there, close enough for her to feel the terrifying stillness radiating from him, and for several long, endless seconds, the entire church fell so silent, a person might have heard candle wax dripping onto the altar. His gray eyes left her face, lowered slowly, and came to rest on the torn fragments of lace pinned into her dark hair. And at that exact moment, something in his ice-cold face cracked, just slightly. Drake Holloway slowly lifted one hand, and the motion was so deliberate that the entire church seemed to hold its breath as it watched. Then his fingers lightly touched one torn strip of lace hanging beside Cora's face, gently and almost tremulously, as though he were touching something sacred that might vanish with a single hard breath. And then he froze. His hand stopped in midair, his jaw tightened, a muscle along his cheek pulling taut before trembling violently in a way he could not suppress. His gray eyes, cold as steel and never known to reveal the slightest emotion before hundreds of powerful people, suddenly darkened with something deep, painful, and ancient, a grief buried for so many years that had just been awakened by a strip of ruined silk. He recognized it. He recognized every stitch, every pattern of lace worked by hand in a technique that only one person in this world had ever possessed, every tiny detail he had carved into his memory from the time he was only a boy. This was his mother's wedding veil. This was Rosalind Holloway's veil. The thing that had vanished from his life along with her on that fateful night so many years ago, the thing he had spent 10 years and an entire fortune trying to trace through underground auctions, antique dealers, and the darkest corners of this world. The thing he had almost despaired of ever finding again. And now it was here before him, torn into pieces and pinned into the hair of a stranger bride in the middle of a wedding he had never been invited to. For one long moment, so suffocating it seemed endless, Drake said nothing at all. He only stood there staring at the jagged cuts, and the stillness radiating from him was more terrifying than any rage could have been. Then he slowly lifted his head, his eyes leaving the veil and sweeping across the church, slowly, coldly, until that deadly gaze came to rest on the two faces shrinking into themselves in the front row. Marguerite and Priscilla Ashford nearly collapsed beneath the weight of that look. "Close the book, Father," Drake said, his voice low but carrying all the way to the final pew with a clarity so chilling it sounded like a command no one could defy. Father Donovan trembled so badly he nearly dropped the Bible, then hastily shut it with fumbling hands. Drake turned toward the congregation, and when he spoke again, every word rang out with an absolute authority nothing could shake. "This wedding ends here," he declared, and the words fell across the sanctuary like a sentence pronounced. "The veil you have just destroyed isn't some ordinary object. It is property of the Holloway family, stolen from us many years ago. And you," his gaze drove straight into the two Ashford women, "took scissors to something that belongs to me, something I have searched for longer than any of you could possibly imagine." A wave of terror spread through the pews, and the panicked whispers died at once beneath the force of his eyes. Drake took one slow step toward the front row, and the 6 men in black suits moved soundlessly with him, making the very air feel thick with unspoken threat. "You thought your money and your bloodline would protect you," he said quietly, his voice now lowered to a register so cold it seemed to slide over the skin like a blade. "You've grown used to believing you could trample anyone you pleased without ever facing consequences. But today you chose the wrong thing to destroy, and the wrong man to make your enemy." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because every quiet word sent a chill down the spine of every person in that church. And both Marguerite and Priscilla understood that the world they had always known had just collapsed beneath their feet. The deathly silence in the sanctuary was torn apart by Priscilla's trembling voice. She sprang up from the pew, her legs so unsteady that she had to clutch the back of the seat in front of her to keep from falling. "Mr. Holloway, we didn't know," she stammered, her once arrogant face now twisted with panic. "We thought it was only some cheap scrap of fabric she bought to pretend she belonged to our class. We swear we would never have dared touch anything belonging to your family if we had known." Marguerite rose beside her daughter as well, trying to salvage the last scrap of dignity, but her voice had already broken apart. "This must be a terrible misunderstanding, sir. Our family has always respected the rules. We're willing to do anything to make this right." Drake did not bother to look at them again. His gaze was as cold as ice in the dead of winter. "Ignorance is not a defense for destruction," he said quietly. "You didn't ruin it because you thought it was cheap. You ruined it because you wanted to hurt a woman whose kindness and talent you could never reach. Just then, Theodore staggered forward, raising both hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, and then something no one had expected happened. He dropped to his knees right there on the altar steps, before 500 people who had once respected his family. "Mr. Holloway, please," Theodore begged, his voice frantic and humiliating. "I'll pay for every bit of damage. However much the veil is worth. The Ashford family will write a check today, 10 times, 100 times if necessary. Please, just allow us to finish this ceremony smoothly." Cora turned her head to look at the man she had almost married, and disgust rose inside her so sharply that it nearly made her sick. The arrogance inside, his very pleading, that belief that his money could erase his family's cruelty and mend something destroyed beyond repair, truly made her feel nauseated. She took one step forward, and this time she did not whisper. She let her voice ring out clearly and strongly, echoing into the soaring stone arches, so every person in the sanctuary could hear. "You can't buy your way out of this, Theodore," she said, her voice no longer trembling at all. "And there's no ceremony left to finish. I won't marry you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. I'm standing here, before all these people, to say that I refuse to become your wife, and I refuse to become part of a family that built its wealth on contempt for those it considers beneath it." Theodore flinched as though she had slapped him across the face. A ripple of astonishment spread through the pews, and the very people who had spent the morning whispering cruel things about Cora's poor background now looked at her with an admiration they themselves had not expected. Drake Holloway turned to look at her, and for the first time since he had walked through the church doors, something in his hard face softened slightly, a deep respect flickering through his gray eyes. He gave a small nod, as though acknowledging something he had no longer dared hope to see in another human being. Then he turned to Bruno, his voice low and decisive. "Remove the Ashford family from here. I'll deal with them my way." As the men in black suits moved forward in silence, Drake turned his back on the collapsing family and extended his arm toward Cora. "Miss Bennet," he said softly, his voice so gentle it stunned the entire congregation. "This place no longer deserves your presence. Please allow me to escort you out." Cora looked at the arm offered by the most powerful man in Boston. Then she placed her hand upon it, and together they slowly walked down the aisle, leaving behind the ruins of the Ashford family beneath the stunned gaze of 500 people. The aftermath of the disaster at St. Cecilia Church fell upon the Ashford family so swiftly and so mercilessly that even those who understood the underworld best were astonished by its speed. Drake Holloway did not need violence, did not need open threats. He simply did one thing. He withdrew the invisible threads that had quietly held up the entire Ashford empire for years, without the Ashfords themselves even knowing. By the very next morning, the banks that had always greeted the Ashford family warmly suddenly tightened their grip on enormous loans, citing clauses no one had ever mentioned before. By noon, the two largest partners in the Ashford Group's shipping business abruptly withdrew from contracts that had already been signed, offering no explanation, only cold letters announcing the end of their business relationships. Ashford Group shares plunged without stopping within only a few hours, as investors caught the scent of collapse and rushed to flee. Invitations to high society events that the family had once taken for granted now fell silent. Calls went unanswered, and doors that had always stood wide open were slammed shut in their faces. Consul Whitaker, the man who had once sat in the seat of honor at the wedding, canceled a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars with Theodore's company the very next morning, and his refusal spread like a signal through the entire elite class that the Ashford family had now become something poisonous no one dared touch. The story of the torn veil and the powerful man who had ended the wedding swept through Boston with the speed of a wildfire, whispered in every elegant drawing room, every private club, every banquet table of the upper class. And each time it was retold, the contempt for the Ashfords deepened. The charity boards where Marguerite had once proudly held the chair quietly sent her letters requesting her resignation. Friends of several decades suddenly became strangers, evasive and distant, pretending not to see her in a crowd. In less than a month, the family that had once held vast wealth and a position that seemed impossible to shake had lost almost everything. Not because of a bullet or a fist, but because of something far more terrifying, the absolute rejection of the very world they had believed they belonged to. Theodore Ashford collapsed more pitifully than anyone, crushed by the scandal, pursued by creditors, and above all terrified of Drake Holloway's shadow. He no longer had the courage to remain in the city where every gaze looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Only a few weeks after the ruined wedding, Theodore quietly transferred whatever remained of himself to a remote branch of the company in a small city on the West Coast, fleeing from humiliation, from gossip, and from the name Holloway itself, which now haunted him in every sleep. He vanished from Boston without a word of farewell, leaving behind a shattered family and a reputation that had completely collapsed. But while Theodore chose to run and Marguerite chose to shrink back into disgrace, Priscilla Ashford had no intention of bowing her head and accepting fate. In the mansion in Newport, now silent and cold, she sat by the window looking out at the sea, her eyes dry with not a single tear left, only a sharp and hateful coldness remaining in her gaze. She felt no remorse for what she had done. In her twisted mind, the guilty one was not herself, but the poor girl who had dared step into her world and then dragged the entire family down with her. And as she clenched her hand so tightly that her carefully manicured nails dug into her palm, she swore silently that Cora Bennett would one day pay for everything she had caused. 3 days after the ruined wedding, a glossy black sedan stopped in front of the old apartment building where Cora lived, looking entirely out of place on the narrow street, lined with red brick buildings faded by time. From the car stepped a woman in her 40s, sharp and composed, her hair pinned neatly and her black suit tailored with care down to every stitch. She introduced herself as Vittoria Falcone, then handed Cora a thick, cream-colored envelope, with nothing on it except a wax seal stamped with an emblem Cora did not recognize. Inside was a handwritten card in firm, decisive script, inviting her to the Holloway mansion. "Mr. Holloway is very eager to see you again," Vittoria said, her voice low and calm, revealing not the slightest trace of emotion. "The car will take you there if you agree. The decision is entirely yours. There is no coercion here." Something in the woman's composure made Cora trust her, and after a brief hesitation, she nodded. The car carried her away from the familiar streets of Boston, through suburbs that grew sparser and quieter, until it turned onto a long private road, shaded on both sides by rows of ancient trees stripped bare of leaves. The Holloway mansion appeared at the end of the road like a castle of gray stone rising in the middle of a desolate landscape, its tall, narrow windows reflecting the cold light of the afternoon sky, and the whole structure radiated a dark elegance, magnificent yet lonely, beautiful yet stained by the color of buried secrets. Vittoria led Cora through long marble-floored hallways, with portraits of Holloway ancestors hanging on both sides, their stern eyes looking down, until they entered a vast study lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling and a fireplace burning low. Drake Holloway stood beside a large mahogany desk, and when he turned to look at her, his painting no longer held the terrifying coldness it had carried in the church, but something quieter and far heavier. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennett," he said. On the desk, carefully spread across layers of specialized archival paper, were the fragments of the veil, arranged with reverence like the bones of a lost living thing. Cora stepped closer, and when she saw them, her heart tightened. Drake remained silent for a long while, his eyes resting on the torn strips of lace. Then he began to speak, his voice low and distant, as though echoing from some deep place in the past. "This veil belonged to my mother, Rosalind Holloway," he said. "She embroidered it herself for her own wedding day, stitch by stitch, using a technique she learned from her grandmother in the homeland across the ocean. It wasn't merely a wedding veil. To her, it was an entire story of lineage, of love, of everything she cherished most." He paused, and Cora saw his knuckles tighten against the edge of the desk. "Many years ago, when I was still very young, there was a night when everything in my life changed forever. My mother was gone that night, in an incident that, even now, still has many things left unexplained, and along with her, this veil vanished without a trace. It was taken from my family, smuggled out through the darkest channels of this world, and through all these years I've searched for it without stopping, not only because it is the last relic of my mother, but because I've always believed it holds something, a piece of the truth that someone deliberately buried along with her." He lifted his eyes to Cora, and in those gray eyes, for the first time, she saw not power, but a profound loss that had never been healed. Drake stepped around the mahogany desk and stood beside Cora, his gaze coming to rest on one particular strip of lace lying apart from the others, a section of edging yellowed by the years but still preserving its exquisite embroidery. "When my people brought this veil back to me, after it had been torn apart," he said slowly, "I had my finest specialists examine it, and they discovered something even I had never known throughout all those years of hunting for it. He pointed to the lace border, where the tiny stitches formed a pattern that at first glance anyone would have mistaken for ordinary decoration. My mother hid something inside these very stitches. A message, a code, encrypted through the hand embroidery technique that belonged to her alone. My specialists confirmed that it exists. They can see the unusual structure in the way the stitches were arranged, but none of them has the ability to decode it, because doing so requires someone who not only understands antique embroidery techniques, but is also delicate enough to read the silent language hidden in every thread. Cora bent down to study the strip of lace he had indicated, and at once her eyes, trained through so many years, recognized what he had just described. There was an irregularity in the rhythm of the stitches, a hidden order beneath a surface that seemed random. A hand that had deliberately woven something into it, something only those who truly understood the craft could recognize. Her heart began to beat faster. In that moment, the artisan in her was drawn in with irresistible force, because this was not merely an old veil, but a riddle woven from the love and secrets of a woman long dead. Drake turned to look at her, and his voice grew more solemn. "Miss Bennett, I've looked into you. I know about the work you once did in conservation workshops, about the antique textiles you brought back to life when everyone else had given up, and I know that you were the one who spent 9 months restoring this veil when you didn't even know what it truly was. Across this entire country, there is no one else with your hands in your eye. I want to invite you to become the private restoration specialist for the Holloway family. You will have your own workshop here in this mansion, an unlimited budget, and full access to every material you need. And your first task will be to restore my mother's veil, while also decoding the message she hid inside it." Cora stood motionless, her heart torn between many conflicting emotions. One part of her, the artisan yearning to touch a work as extraordinary as this, almost wanted to agree at once, because this was the kind of opportunity any restoration specialist in the world would be willing to sacrifice everything to have. And there was also the burning curiosity about the secret hidden inside the veil, about the story of the woman who had vanished into darkness so many years ago. But another part of her hesitated, because she understood very well who the man standing before her was, an underworld boss, a man all of Boston feared, and stepping into his mansion also meant stepping into a world filled with dangers she could never fully foresee. "Why me?" she asked softly, her eyes lifting to search his for an answer. "You could hire anyone. You could force anyone. Why are you asking for my consent? And why would you trust me with the most precious thing you have?" Drake was silent for a moment. Then he answered, his voice so low and sincere that it startled her. "Because that day in the church, I saw something I hadn't seen in people for a very long time. I saw a woman stand in the middle of a crowd humiliating her, and still refuse to bow her head. A woman who valued beauty and truth more than her own safety. You didn't destroy that veil. You loved it, and that is why I trust you, Miss Bennett, more than anyone else I've ever met." Cora accepted, and during her first days working inside the mansion, as she began carefully studying every fragment of the veil beneath specialized lamps, one question kept returning to her mind and refused to let her go. How could such a precious relic of the Holloway family, something that had been hunted for 10 years without anyone finding it, have been lying quietly inside a damp antique shop in the North End, only to fall into the hands of a poor restoration artisan like her, for a price so small it was almost meaningless? The more she thought about it, the more she felt something was wrong, a coincidence far too large to be merely accidental. She remembered the shopkeeper with the shifty eyes, the way he had rushed to sell the veil off as though he wanted it out of his shop as quickly as possible, and his crude insistence that the item had been bought and sold entirely legally. Cora brought that suspicion to Vittoria, and the sharp woman listened to her with such focus that Cora knew she had touched something important. "You have good instincts, Miss Bennett," Vittoria said quietly, her gaze sharpening. "Let me look into that shopkeeper." Within 2 days, Drake's information network had uncovered everything worth knowing about the antique dealer in the North End, and what Vittoria brought back left both Cora and Drake silent. The shopkeeper was not some insignificant second-hand seller as he appeared to be. He was a link in a smuggling network that moved contraband goods and illegal antiquities, a network that had operated quietly for many years, and most importantly, that network was directly connected to a name Drake had not heard in a very long time. A name that made his face darken the moment Vittoria spoke it. The shop in the North End was one of the transfer points, a place where objects of murky origin had their histories washed clean before being resold to buyers who knew nothing. This is what I can't understand, Cora said, her brows drawing together. If this veil was so valuable and so fiercely sought after, why was it thrown into a shabby shop and sold for almost nothing, instead of being traded in the expensive underground auction rooms where you had been searching? Drake remained thoughtful for a long while, then slowly answered, and his explanation made every piece begin to fit together. Because the people who took it didn't know its true value, he said. All these years, I was searching for a precious Holloway family wedding veil, something clearly described in old records. But the thing that reached your hands no longer looked like that. Over time, the veil had been made to appear older. Its most obvious identifying marks had been removed, and it had been disguised as a nameless piece of antique lace with no history, perhaps by the very people who had deliberately hidden its origin so no one could trace it. To the eye of an ordinary antique dealer, it was only an old item worth a few dollars. Only after it came into your hands, into the hands of someone with enough talent and patience to restore it over 9 months, did the original embroidery, the signs of my family, and even the hidden code slowly begin to appear. You didn't merely find the veil, Miss Bennet. You were the one who woke it. Cora felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the true meaning of those words. It turned out that her stepping into that shop on that rainy afternoon years ago, her emptying her savings to bring the veil home, had not been a simple accident at all. Something larger, darker, had silently led her to this relic. And now, as the veil had been awakened and its secret was beginning to reveal itself, she understood that she was no longer merely an innocent restoration artisan. She had unknowingly stepped into the center of an old and bloody mystery, a mystery that some people had killed to bury, and now those people might not leave her alone once they learned the veil had returned, and that someone was slowly beginning to read what they had believed had been erased forever. The restoration workshop Drake set aside for Cora was in the east wing of the mansion, a spacious room filled with natural light from tall windows, equipped with everything an artisan could dream of, from delicate microscopes and silk threads in every shade to a temperature and humidity control system, precise down to the smallest detail. In that quiet space, Cora slowly found again the piece she had thought she had lost, and each day she bent tirelessly over the fragments of lace, patiently joining back together every thread of the veil. Drake began visiting her workshop, at first only stopping by briefly to ask about her progress, but little by little, those visits grew longer, and he often pulled a stool close to her work table, removed his formal suit jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, and sat quietly watching her hands move with graceful mastery. They spoke for hours, and in those conversations, Cora gradually saw an entirely different person hidden beneath the cold and ruthless shell that all of Boston feared. "She must have loved you very much," Cora said softly one afternoon, while her fingers were gently securing a thread into its proper place. "People don't hide an entire message inside a wedding veil unless they have something terribly important they want to entrust to someone they love." Drake was silent for a while, his eyes following the movements of her hands. "I was 9 years old when my mother was gone," he said at last, and this was the first time he had allowed anyone to touch that memory. "I still remember her scent, lavender and silk thread. She used to sit by the window in the afternoons and embroider, and I would sit at her feet, watching her fingers move exactly the way yours are moving now. She always told me that every stitch carried meaning, that a person could tell an entire story with nothing but thread and cloth, if they were patient enough and sincere enough." He stopped, and Cora noticed his voice lowering slightly. "I didn't fully understand her words then. I was only a child, but after the night I lost her, I spent the rest of my life trying to understand, and trying to find the only thing of hers that remained." Cora paused, lifted her eyes to him, and in that moment she saw not a powerful boss, but a 9-year-old boy still standing beside an empty window, waiting for someone who would never return. "I lost my parents when I was 16, she said softly, sharing something she rarely told anyone. "After that, I lived with my grandmother, and she was the one who taught me this craft. She used to say that damaged things aren't worthless, that sometimes something that has been hurt can become more beautiful than it was when it was whole, if we know how to honor its scars. I think that's why I chose this work, because I understand what it feels like to be seen by the world as broken, as something to be discarded." Drake looked at her for a long time, and something in his eyes changed, a quiet understanding beginning to grow between two people who had come from worlds so far apart. In the still room, with only the soft ticking of the antique clock and the faint crackle of the fireplace, the distance between them seemed to narrow in a way they both felt but neither dared to name. When Cora reached for a spool of thread and her fingers accidentally brushed against his hand, both of them went still for a breathless moment, and an emotion both tense and tempting passed between them like an electric current. Drake was the first to draw his hand back. He stood a little too quickly, and when he excused himself and left the workshop, Cora realized her heart was beating faster than usual, and that the most dangerous man in Boston had begun slipping into the hidden corners of her heart in a way she had never expected. It took nearly 3 weeks of tireless work, working beneath the lamps until late into the night, before Cora gradually decoded the message hidden inside the embroidery. The secret lay in the rhythm of the stitches themselves, in the way Rosalind Holloway had skillfully changed the length and direction of each thread according to her own private rule, turning what looked like decorative patterns into a system of symbols that only someone who truly understood the art of antique embroidery could read. When the final pieces at last fitted together and the entire message appeared before her eyes, Cora sat motionless in her chair for a very long time, her hands trembling, because what she had just uncovered was heavier and more painful than anything she had ever imagined. That evening, she sent for Drake to come to the workshop. When he stepped inside and saw her pale face, he knew at once that she had found something. "I've decoded it," she said softly, her voice catching. "Mr. Holloway, this message has 2 parts, and I don't know where to begin." Drake pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his face tense but still. "Tell me everything," he said. Cora drew in a deep breath. "The first part is an accusation. Your mother knew her life was being threatened. She knew who was behind the plot against her family, and she embroidered that person's name into this veil as a final piece of evidence, in case she never had the chance to speak the truth aloud. That person was someone inside your own family, someone she called Gennaro." When that name was spoken, Cora saw Drake's face freeze, his gray eyes darkening as though covered by a shadow, and his tall body seemed to turn to stone. Gennaro, the cousin-uncle he had once trusted, the man who had stood beside him through the years of grief after his mother was gone, the man who had pretended to share his loss while those very hands had been stained by the crime. A shock ran through Drake's entire being, a terrible mixture of boiling rage and the pain of a betrayal that had smoldered for years and had only now been laid bare. But Cora had not finished. "And the second part," she continued, and this time her voice broke, her eyes shimmering with tears. "The second part isn't an accusation. It is a message your mother left for you." Drake lifted his head sharply, and for the first time since Cora had known him, she saw naked vulnerability appear in the eyes of the most powerful man in Boston. "Read it to me," he said, and his voice was hoarse, almost nothing more than a breath. Cora lowered her eyes to the translation she had carefully written out, and she read the words Rosalind Holloway had entrusted to every stitch, meant for her beloved little boy. "To my beloved son, if one day you are reading these words, then perhaps I am no longer beside you. I beg you not to let pain and hatred devour who you are, not to let the darkness turn you into someone like those who harmed us. You were born with a kind heart, I know that, and no matter how much life tries to forge you into stone and steel, I beg you to hold on to that gentle part within you. Live a life that would make me proud, and find someone who will love you for who you are, not for the power or fear you bring. I love you, always." When Cora finished reading, the room sank into absolute silence. And then something she had never thought she would witness happened. Drake Holloway, the man no one in the city dared look directly in the eye, slowly bowed his head, his shoulders trembling, and a single tear slipped silently down his stone-cold face. For so many years, he had searched for this veil in order to hunt down his enemy, in order to take revenge, but what he found in the end was not a weapon of vengeance, but the final embrace of the mother he had believed was lost forever. Cora quietly placed her hand over his, and this time, he did not pull away. While Cora and Drake were gradually uncovering the truth buried for so many years, elsewhere in the city, an old and dangerous force had also begun to sense that something was wrong. Gennaro Holloway was a man far too accustomed to existing in the shadows, and for many years, he had lived a peaceful life beneath the cover of a respected member of the family, while quietly benefiting from the very crime he had committed on that fateful night long ago. But when news that Rosalind's wedding veil had been found and was being restored reached him through underground channels, a cold unease began to creep into him. He knew better than anyone that Rosalind had been an intelligent and suspicious woman, and he couldn't rule out the possibility that she had left some trace behind, some proof that could expose him after all these years. He couldn't allow that to happen. And to stop it, he needed a way into the closed world surrounding Cora Bennett, the woman holding the key to unlocking his secret. That was why Gennaro deliberately sought out a name his network told him was also carrying a deep hatred for that very girl. One evening, inside the cold mansion in Newport, where Priscilla Ashford was living through the bitter days of her collapse, a strange man appeared without warning. Priscilla, now wary and sharp-tongued after everything that had happened, at first intended to send him away, but his first words made her stop and listen. "You and I have a common enemy, Miss Ashford," Gennaro said, his voice smooth but hiding a danger that made Priscilla shiver despite herself. "The girl who destroyed your family is also the person threatening everything I have built. I think we can help each other." Priscilla narrowed her eyes at the stranger, suspicion mingling with a flicker of dark interest in her gaze. "Who are you, and why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice still guarded. Gennaro smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. "My name matters less than what I can give you. You want revenge on Cora Bennett. You want to see her pay for the fall of your family. As for me, I need her to stop before she digs too deeply into things that should have remained buried forever. You have access to places I cannot reach. You know the people, the relationships, the society circles she is now moving through. And I have the means and the people to make your wishes become real. Alone, neither you nor I can touch her, because she is protected by Drake Holloway. But together, we can find the opening." Priscilla remained silent for a long while, weighing that dangerous offer. Reason told her that joining hands with such a shadowy man was madness, that she was pushing herself into a swamp even deeper than the abyss into which her family had just fallen. But the hatred inside her had corroded every bit of wisdom she had left, and the thought of seeing Cora Bennett brought down, of giving that girl back all the humiliation Priscilla believed she had inflicted upon her family, was far too tempting to refuse. At last, she lifted her head, and a cold, twisted smile appeared on the face that had once been considered elegant. "Fine," Priscilla said softly. "I don't need to know who you are, and I don't care what you want from her. I need only one thing, to see Cora Bennett lose everything she has, the same way she took everything from me." And so, in that dark room, a poisonous alliance was formed between two people from two different worlds who shared one thing in their hearts: hatred. Outside the window, the sea waves kept striking the rocks in their steady rhythm. Cold and indifferent, completely unaware of the storm, these two people were quietly beginning to kindle. Gennaro's network moved quickly and quietly, and it was the information Priscilla provided about Cora's habits, schedule, and the weak points in the protection around her that helped him find the right moment to strike. Late one evening, when most of the mansion had sunk into silence, and Cora was still lingering in the restoration workshop to finish the final stages of her work, two strange men took advantage of a gap in the security team's shift and slipped into the east wing of the building. Cora was bent over her work table, completely absorbed in her work, when a sudden feeling of unease made her lift her head, and she went still when she saw two figures quietly moving toward her from the doorway. Instinct told her these men had not come with good intentions, and when one of them spoke, his voice cold and threatening, their purpose became painfully clear. "You've been digging too deep, Miss Bennett," the man said, moving one step closer at a time. "Some things should have been left alone, and you're about to learn that lesson." Cora quickly backed away, her heart pounding, her eyes darting around the room in search of a way out or anything that might help her. She snatched up the veil being restored, driven by the instinct to protect what was most precious, then slowly retreated toward the corner of the room where Drake had installed an emergency alarm bell. In that desperate moment, she threw herself toward the bell and struck it with all her strength just before one of the two men could seize her. The shrill alarm instantly tore through the silence of the entire mansion, echoing through the stone corridors, and the men froze for a moment, confusion plain on their faces as they realized the plan had been broken. Cora used that instant to wrench herself free, clutching the veil tightly to her chest and retreating deeper into the corner, putting anything she could reach between herself and the attackers. A table, a chair, while her heart felt as though it might leap out of her chest. In only a few seconds that felt endless, hurried footsteps thundered from the hallway outside, and the workshop door was thrown open. Drake Holloway rushed in, followed by Bruno and his men, and in the moment he saw Cora curled in the corner with two strangers closing in on her. Something in his eyes blazed more fiercely than anything Cora had ever witnessed. Drake's security team quickly subdued the intruders, a brief and violent struggle breaking out before they were completely overpowered and dragged outside. But Drake barely seemed to care about them. The moment the room was safe, he crossed the workshop in only a few strides and came to Cora. His hands, usually so steady and cold, now trembling slightly as he lifted her face so he could see her clearly. "Are you all right?" he asked, and his voice, usually calm and commanding, broke with a naked fear he couldn't hide. "Did they hurt you?" "Look at me, Cora." Cora lifted her eyes to him, and when she saw real fear in the eyes of the man the entire city dreaded, she felt something inside her melt. "I'm all right," she whispered, though her whole body was still trembling. "I'm still all right. The veil is safe too." But Drake no longer seemed to care about the veil. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, as though he feared that if he let go, she would disappear. And in that most vulnerable moment, two people who had grown far too used to carrying every pain alone suddenly realized they were no longer lonely. "I thought I had lost you," Drake whispered into her hair, his voice choked. "When I heard that alarm, I couldn't think of anything except you. I can't lose you, Cora. I can't." And for the first time, Cora understood that this man, who had lost so much in his life, was now more afraid of the thought of losing her than of anything else in the world. After that horrifying night, Drake did not allow himself to rest for even a second. He knew the attack had not been an accident, that the intruders had been guided by someone who understood Cora's schedule and the weak points in the protection around her, and he was determined to find the person behind it. Victoria began investigating with all her usual sharpness and coldness, following even the smallest clues, interrogating the two captured men, tracing the money trails and the secret communications. Within only a few days, the full picture of the conspiracy slowly emerged, and what Victoria brought back and placed on Drake's desk made his face darken with rage. The two intruders were Gennaro's men, which was not beyond what he had expected. But what left both Drake and Cora stunned was the second name connected to the matter. The name of the person who had given Gennaro inside information about the world Cora was living in. It was Priscilla Ashford. "She was the one who pointed the way," Victoria said, placing before them the evidence of secret meetings between Priscilla and Gennaro's people. Gennaro deliberately sought her out and used her hatred for Miss Bennet. She didn't know who Gennaro truly was or what he wanted, but she was willing to join hands with him just to see Miss Bennet fall. When she heard those words, Cora felt a sharp pain spread through her chest, a wound deeper than even the fear she had felt on the night of the attack. She had thought everything with the Ashford family was over, that she had turned the page on that painful old chapter and begun a new life. But now she realized that Priscilla's hatred remained untouched, even growing more poisonous after the collapse of her family, and that woman had been willing to put Cora in danger, simply to satisfy her thirst for revenge. "Why?" Cora whispered, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I never did anything to hurt her. I only refused to bow my head before their cruelty. And still, she won't let me go, even after I've left their lives." Drake came to her side and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture that only a few weeks earlier no one could have imagined from a man like him. "Some people can't bear to see someone they once looked down on remain standing and live better than they do," he said softly. "Their cruelty isn't your fault, Cora. It's a sickness inside their own souls. And you must never blame yourself for someone else's ugliness." Cora was silent for a long while, letting the tears run down before drying them herself, and when she lifted her head, Drake saw in her eyes no fear and no woundedness, but the same iron resolve he had once seen in her at St. Cecilia Church, the resolve of a woman who was too tired of always being the one forced to endure. "I won't hide," she said, her voice steady again. "All my life, I've always bowed my head, always endured, always tried to make myself small enough so no one would be uncomfortable. But I've learned one thing. Hiding never makes people like them stop. I want to face this, Drake. I want it to end, once and for all, so both you and I can truly be free." Drake looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes rose a mixture of worry and deep respect. A part of him wanted to hide her away, wanted to build a fortress around her so no force in the world could ever touch her again. But he understood that doing so would take from her the very strength that had made him love her. The strength of a person who dared to stand upright in the middle of a storm. "All right," he finally said softly, tightening his hand gently around hers. "We'll end this, together. But you have to promise me one thing, that you won't ever leave my sight until this is over." And Cora, for the first time after so many years of fighting the whole world on her own, nodded, accepting that someone else would carry the weight with her. Drake had everything he needed to end Gennaro in the way the underworld usually dealt with traitors, and one part of him, the part forged through years of pain and violence, longed to do exactly that. When Vittoria arranged a meeting with Gennaro inside an old abandoned warehouse near the harbor, Drake walked into that place with the rage that had smoldered inside him for so many years now boiling in his veins. Gennaro stood there, older now but still carrying the same sly composure, and when he saw the face of the nephew he had betrayed, a faint smile touched his lips. "So you finally know?" Gennaro said, his voice holding not the slightest trace of remorse. "Your mother was always too clever to live long. She saw too much, knew too much. I only did what had to be done to protect my position in this family." Those arrogant words poured oil onto the fire burning inside Drake, and for one moment, he stepped forward, his hand tightening into a fist, his whole body trembling with the desire to pour all the pain of those years onto the man who had destroyed his life. But at that very instant, Rosalind's final message echoed in his mind. The words Cora had read to him, the plea of a mother asking him not to let darkness devour who he was, not to let that man turn him into someone just like himself. And beside those words, he heard Cora's gentle but unwavering voice, the woman who had stood before him the night before, and told him that if he ended this in blood, then Gennaro would win, because he would have dragged Drake down to his level and turned him into exactly the thing his mother had begged him never to become. Drake stood still, his breathing heavy, and in a fierce inner struggle that seemed to last forever, he made the hardest choice of his life. Slowly, he loosened his fist. "No," he said quietly, his voice trembling but firm. "I won't kill you, because if I do, I'll become you, and that is the one thing my mother begged me never to let happen. You aren't worth the price of my soul." Instead of bloody revenge, Drake chose a path that frightened Gennaro even more. With all the power and vast network in his hands, he did what very few men could have done. He exposed every one of Gennaro's crimes to the light, not only to the authorities through carefully arranged evidence, but also to the very underworld Gennaro had relied upon to survive. Within a few weeks, Gennaro was stripped of every bit of power, every ally, every resource he had built over so many years, abandoned and rejected by the very people who had once feared him. He became a man with nothing, completely isolated, living out the rest of his days in fear and contempt, a fate that, for a man like him, was worse than death. As for Priscilla Ashford, the evidence of her role in the plot to attack Cora was fully gathered by Vittoria and handed over to the authorities. She had to face the legal consequences of what she had done, and this time, no amount of money or Ashford reputation could save her anymore. When Cora heard how Drake had handled everything, she went to find him, and she saw in his eyes a peace she had never seen there before, as though the burden of so many years of hatred had finally been set down. "You did the right thing," she said softly, placing her hand over his. Drake looked at her, and a rare, faint, genuine smile appeared on his face. "You saved me, Cora," he replied, "not from Gennaro, from the man I almost became. My mother begged me to find someone who could love me for who I truly am. I think I've finally found her." With the final threat resolved and the darkness of the past at last pushed back, Cora returned to the work of restoring Rosalind's veil with an entirely different state of mind, no longer with fear or the burden of an unsolved secret, but with a pure love for the art and for the woman who had woven it. She stood before the fragments carefully arranged on the work table, facing the most difficult question a restorer can face. She could try to hide the cuts, stitch them back together so delicately that no one would ever know the veil had once been destroyed, returning it to its original appearance, as though that pain had never happened. But the longer Cora looked at the wounds in the fabric, the more she understood that this was not the right path. She remembered the words her grandmother had once taught her, that sometimes something that had been hurt could become more beautiful than it was when it was whole, if we knew how to honor its scars. And so she made a daring decision. Instead of hiding the cuts, she would honor them. She drew inspiration from an ancient Eastern art, where broken pottery was repaired with pure gold, turning the cracks into gleaming lines, so that the restored object was not healed by concealing its history, but by making that very history part of its beauty. Cora spent many weeks carefully threading strands of gold as fine as silk along every tier in the veil. transforming the cruel cuts that had once been made out of malice into golden embroidery lines that shimmered like sunlight. Beneath her gifted hands, Rosalind Holloway's veil slowly came back to life. And when she completed the final step, it was no longer a damaged relic, but a new work of art, where painful history and resilient survival blended together into a beauty that moved the heart. The golden threads running across the old lace did not make the veil look damaged. On the contrary, they told a story of endurance, of how something beautiful could be torn apart and still rise again, more beautiful than ever. When Drake stepped into the workshop and saw the finished work for the first time, he stood silent for a very long while, his eyes resting on the golden lines glittering beneath the light, and Cora noticed something in his face quietly tremble. "I didn't want to hide what happened to it," Cora said softly, standing beside him. "Because those wounds are part of this veil's story now. Trying to erase them would be like pretending the pain never existed. But if we dare to face it, dare to turn it into part of ourselves, then it won't be a wound anymore. It will become proof that we survived." Drake turned to look at her, and his gray eyes, once so cold, were now filled with a tenderness that only a few months earlier no one would have believed him capable of feeling. Over the weeks he had spent beside her, he had changed in ways even he did not fully realize. He smiled more. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be gentle. He learned how to release the burden of hatred he had carried for his entire life. "You know," he said softly, his eyes never leaving her, "I think my mother would have been very fond of you. She would have seen in you the very things she always hoped I would find in another human being." Cora lifted her eyes to him, and the distance between them, the distance once guarded by caution and old wounds, now seemed to disappear completely. In the room filled with warm light, beside the veil brought back to life with pure gold, two people whom life had once treated as broken, shattered, and no longer whole had found in each other a wholeness neither of them had ever expected. The unveiling ceremony for the reborn veil took place at an elegant private event held in the grand hall of the Holloway mansion, a place that had once been steeped only in darkness and sorrowful secrets, now brilliantly lit by candles and pure white flowers. The guest list included renowned historians, respected conservation specialists, and the few people Drake truly trusted, a gathering entirely different from the crowd of 500 who had once witnessed Cora's humiliation in St. Cecilia Church. That evening, Cora stepped into the grand hall wearing a deep midnight blue dress she had designed and sewn with her own hands, every cut and seam radiating the refinement and confidence of a master artisan. And when Drake saw her, he came forward and offered her his arm just as he had done on that fateful day in the sanctuary. Except this time, in his eyes there was no longer the coldness of an underworld boss, but pride and a deep love for the woman beside him. At the center of the grand hall, inside a carefully lit glass case, Rosalind Holloway's veil was displayed in all the beauty of its rebirth, the golden threads running along the antique lace, shimmering beneath the lights as though the fabric had been bathed in sunlight. And as the guests came forward one by one to admire it, more than a few fell silent with emotion before the story of survival it told. As the evening slowly came to an end, and the final guests had gone, Drake led Cora to the glass case, gently opened it, lifted the veil with careful hands, and turned to place it in hers. "I want you to keep it," he said softly. And when Cora started to protest that this was the most precious relic of his family, he gently shook his head. "For 10 years, I searched for this veil, believing it would give me closure, revenge, some kind of answer. But you're the one who gave me back what I had truly lost. You gave me back a part of my soul I thought had died the night I lost my mother. You taught me that wounded things don't lose their value, that even a heart hardened by hatred can still be healed." Cora held the veil against her chest, her eyes shimmering with tears. And when she looked up at the man all of Boston had once feared, she no longer saw a powerful boss, but only a human being who had learned how to love and be loved in return. And in that moment, beneath the warm candlelight of the grand hall, two people who had once been lonely, once treated by life as unworthy, found in each other a true home, a love built not on power or status, but on understanding, respect, and compassion for one another. The story of Cora Bennett and Drake Holloway reminds us of a simple yet profound truth, that a person's worth is never found in their origins, wealth, or social position, but in their character, their talent, and the dignity they preserve even in the darkest moments. Those who trample others simply because they believe them beneath themselves will eventually have to face the consequences of their own cruelty. while those who know how to cherish beauty, truth, and human dignity will always find light, even at the end of the darkest road. And sometimes, the wounds life leaves upon us, if faced with courage, become the golden threads that create our own beauty and strength. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Cora and Drake? What part of their journey moved you the most? Leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always waiting to hear your voice. Thank you for spending your time watching until the very final moment. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.